If there's one thing that philosophers agree on, and they don't agree on much, it's that Kant was the greatest modern philosopher, certainly the most important philosopher since Plato and Aristotle. But they don't agree on why he was so important. In fact, lots of people think that he's important for exactly the wrong reasons because of his theory of knowledge. Now, I think his theory of knowledge was important. I think the idea that you can't prove from the outside that all of this is not a dream, that you can't prove the reality or validity of any of our experiences from outside experience, because our most important ideas, our most important concepts, like the concept of cause or substance, are part of experience themselves. It's a deep and amazing idea, and it's affected the whole way that we perceive the world and talk about perception and everything that's been done ever since. So that was certainly a totally important thing that he did, but I don't think they've focused on what was even more important to him. And that's, if I have to focus on one thing, that's the distinction between is and ought. Is has to do with truth, facts about the world, all the things that we know or don't know, can't verify, depends on how. And the ought has to do with the way the world should be. Okay, so what you have here is a distinction between morality, if you like, which is the subject of the ought, and science in the broadest general sense, which is the subject of the is or truth. What people tend to want to do is to reduce one to the other, and indeed life would be easier if we could. Life would be easier if you could say, well, the world really is the way it ought to be. Actually, that's what we want. Or they say, and this is something that Hume did, if we can't find a justification for the ought in the natural world, if we can't prove that things ought to be one way rather than another, then actually the ought doesn't matter very much, or it's just a subjective matter of feeling. And there you get, of course, the short road to relativism. If what we ought to do isn't a matter of truth in the way that, believing that the earth is round, or I don't know, the ground is soft because it rained last night. If you can't show moral principles to be true in those kinds of ways, then they don't have the same kind of status. Then they're not real, okay? They're just subjective. And one of the deepest things that Kant did was to show that these are two completely different kinds of discourse. The one has to do with ideas, and the other has to do with facts. And it's crucial for being human and being honest, on the one hand, to realize that these two are separate, and that as much as we want to try to bring them together, we'll never be able to do so. If we could do so, it would be the best of all possible worlds, and that would be a world in which we couldn't actually live in, because there would be essentially everything would stop if the world was as it ought to be. Okay, but the gap between the is and the ought, and the fact that most of what we do with our lives is trying to narrow that gap to some extent. That's what structures human experience, and that, I think, is probably Kant's deepest thought. I mean, he really was truly incredible. He was wrong about all kinds of things, but he came up with so many extraordinary, deep ideas that it's hard to list them all without, doing several courses on it. But if I have to say one thing that I think is really deep and also very, very relevant for the way we live now, it's recognizing the depth and the seriousness of the difference between is and ought. The whole discussion of realism and idealism that you get today, for example, when talking about foreign policy, usually tends to understand or not take seriously enough the distinction between the is and the ought, and the fact that we have to acknowledge the legitimacy of both of them.